Hey everybody, Jacob's Painting here with a new tutorial series, and I've got myself a OG Marneus Calgar in its original metal, and we're going to be doing kind of a masterclass series on this. We're going to be painting it start to finish over a series of videos, and this is the first one. And we're going with my Ultramarines workup that I've done in the past for our Ultramarines Just the Tips videos, but also cover it here. Our base over the black primer is going to be Vallejo Mecha color Titan blue, and I'm very thinly spraying this over the model so that it's a very dark midnight blue with some of that black showing through in the details and the darkest shadows. So we're already starting off with a lot of contrast with this workup. Our next color is going to be Magic Blue from Vallejo Game Air. This is where we kind of depart from the bog standard Ultramarines color scheme. This is the way I like to paint my Ultramarines. So instead of going with a Ultramarine blue, I skip that color completely and go up to Magic Blue and put that over our Titan blue from Mecha color. And this is where I start targeting highlights on these Space Marine models that try to get the tops of the larger surfaces, like top of the shoulder pad, tops of his power fist, and then for the chest and the legs I try to follow down the center line to get a really distinct high contrast highlight on those. And I'm just leaving the Titan blue in the recesses, and I'm still leaving some of that darkest black in the deepest shadows. So even with this, we're already getting a lot of contrast, and this blue is going to go from pure black to the brightest blue that we possibly can make it, so that it's got that really heroic ultramarine shine with a lot of high contrast in between. Next we're going to go to Electric Blue from Vallejo Game Air, and this bright neon blue is what is really going to give us that iconic high contrast Ultramarines look that I really like. It's sort of a baby blue, you can call it a baby blue if you want, but I think it's more on the neon spectrum. I really like this color. This is what we're going to be doing our little spot highlights with, targeted highlights, as I like to say in some of my videos. And I'm just going to be focusing again on those brightest points, the top of the shoulder pad, brightest point on his outstretched power fist there. On the back of his Terminator armor, I'm going to get some of the corner areas and fade those down, and get a little radial highlight and that little plate on the top of the Terminator armor. And on areas where you do a center line highlight, like on his legs, you still want to focus that center line, but we're going to let that color build up only on like the top of his knee and the top of his toe and his boot and stuff like that. And so we're getting that kind of 0 to 100 mile an hour contrast on this Ultramarine really easily just by skipping one of the mid-tone colors, going from really dark to really bright very quickly, and it looks really cool. Then I'm going to take our electric blue that was in the airbrush, and I'm going to mix it with a little bit of our Stynylrez white primer. You don't have to use white primer specifically for this step. You can use an ivory paint, you can use just regular old white paint if you've got that, but for the airbrush I like taking the airbrush ready white primer from Stynylrez and mixing that in because it just works really well. I'm going to add a little bit more flow improver to that just so the white doesn't speckle on me, and I'm going to take the areas where I did those really targeted spot highlights and an even smaller spot highlight with this mixed color to get that hard shine effect that really pops out those blues. Like, this is really going to take it over the top, and it gets that really heroic looking kind of comic book style blue where it starts off at pure black and then goes through the gradient all the way to kind of a little bit of a white shine. And it looks kind of splotchy and all over the place right now, but as we paint more of the model and we block in more of the stuff on his model with different colors, it's going to separate those fields of blue, and it's going to give them a clear beginning and end, and those gradients are going to look amazing. And then all of those colors are going to get tied together when we put a wash on them. Now I'm just going to take some model color black, and I'm going to hand paint that onto his cape, because he's got a little bit of blue, different blue colors kind of splashed on there from when we were doing our airbrush. And so what I want to do is have a completely black field for when we airbrush our cape here. And you know, it doesn't take very long. I've got it pretty thinned out. You don't have to really worry about covering up stuff too much. The blues are pretty dark down in the recesses where we got our overspray. But this is just going to make everything really clean, because I have this model fully assembled except for his head, and I want to airbrush this cape to give him a really cool looking red cape to go along with his blue armor. But I want to go in and cover those deepest areas with our model color black, so that when I start doing our airbrush, we have the same ultra clean high contrast between pure black and our reds as we go up through the red gradient. So this just helps with that, makes everything cleaner. While you're doing this, on any model that you want to be doing the same effect on, you definitely want to take your time. I'm using a little bit of a larger brush here just because I want to get through this pretty quickly, but if you don't feel comfortable doing that, or if you need to get into a tight space, feel free to switch to a smaller brush and get into those nooks and crannies and get that stuff blacked out. Because whenever you're doing a cape like this, or like a robe or whatever, you definitely want to have a clean field to put that paint onto, just like a clean background to spray that paint on, and it really helps. Makes a huge difference. Alright, now we're going to get out some Game Extra Opaque Heavy Red. It's made by Vallejo. It's a really, really great base color. But here I'm going to put it in the airbrush because it's pretty dark, and I'm going to use a lot of flow improver. The Game Extra Opaque line that Vallejo makes is very, very densely pigmented, but it's got a lot of uses. I really like using it for a lot of different things, especially for doing color workups off of, because it's so dense and so dark most of the time. And I'm just going to be very lightly spraying this red on our cape here, and I'm being careful around where it starts getting close to our areas of blue that we highlighted. You can see I'm using my thumb as kind of a little mask underneath that cape there to make sure that I don't spray like the back of his feet, stuff like that. You can use masking tape if that's what you want to do. You can use a little piece of paper like I'm going to later in this same step to kind of mask off certain areas. Or you can even use some like saran wrap. I know that's a step that some people like to use, kind of mask off different areas of the model. But the two iconic pieces of Marneus's model, the things that are going to catch your eye the most, are going to be his big Terminator armor and his flowing cape. So I want both of those to be an eye catch. I want them both to look really good because that's where people are going to look first, which is why I'm airbrushing both of them. See here, I'm using that little piece of paper to slide up behind his foot there and kind of mask that area off so I don't get any red on our nice blue. Really handy little technique. Just be careful. I'm going about 70% of the way up the cape, just being safe to make sure that I'm not hitting any of the areas that we already airbrushed blue. And so in the deepest recesses of the details of this cape, we still have kind of a pure black going on, and we're going to get that same really high contrast kind of comic book look for the colors in this guy. Next, we're going to get out some Game Air Bloody Red. This is kind of a bright fire engine red, very passionate red, good look for building up a red workup. And I'm going to focus down on the hem of the cape in the lowest areas, and then come from the bottom towards the top, following the largest folds. And that way we're going to create some dips and valleys of color along the folds of the cape. And it's going to help get a more realistic shading of the cape without having to do that by hand. The airbrush helps with that. So it's not just a flat gradient from top to bottom. We have a gradient that's following all of the hills and valleys of those parts of the cape as it's like kind of flowing out. So you have some some raises and some shadowed areas that are going to get different colors on them. So following those folds up from the bottom with our brighter colors helps maintain some shadows down in the recesses. And finally, we're going to get some Hot Orange from Vallejo Game Air. This is a really nice color. It sprays very transparently. I don't know why these two oranges from the Game Air set are like that, but Hot Orange and Fire Orange are like that. They're just very transparent, so you got to take your time. And I'm just lightly building up that color on the bottom of the cape, down on the hem area, just to build up that orange to make it pop a little bit more. And I'm also going to follow those folds up just a little bit when I'm doing that, so that way the red goes all the way across. Next, we're going to focus on his face. We're going to do an airbrush build-up on his face. It looks really nice. I'm going to start off with some Beasty Brown. I like Beasty Brown. It's a good mid-tone brown to start off doing skin tones. I like doing my Space Marines as kind of like an every race, kind of like an in-between. So it's not really going to push one way or the other. It's just kind of a regular every race kind of human workup with a little bit of tan in there. Show he's been on 1,000,000 battlefields under 1,000,000 suns. So after the Beasty Brown, we're going to spray heavy skin tone at a high angle. You can see how I'm positioning the brush there, and very lightly building that up over his face there, so that the deepest details and shadows of his face still have some of that Beasty Brown showing through. And I'm also going to focus straight down the center of his face, like from the top of the brow straight down through his nose down to his chin, to create a second form of contrast from the front to the back, but also from the top to the underneath of his details. And then I'm going to mix some Flat Flesh, which is a really bright flesh tone from Model Color. I'm going to mix that directly into the airbrush pot with some of that heavy skin tone in there, and then reinforce that highlight down the center line. And then this here is a mix of red tone and blue tone from Army Painter. So I'm going to pull out my kind of at-home purple tone and a little bit of red tone and just put a few drops out on my dry palette here and very gently kind of dab that onto his face down into the recesses and just kind of let it settle and sit there. And I like using Army Painter washes for this because they don't immediately stain when they touch the model. They kind of have to dry for a little bit before they start staining anything they touch. And I'm just going to do that a couple of times, once or twice with the purple tone kind of thinned out. And then once that's dry, if I feel that I need more, I'll come in with the red tone. And as I was painting this, I felt like, yeah, it kind of needs some red tone to look a little bit more flushed on the skin and the recesses. So again, a couple of drops out on the palette and just kind of dab that into the recesses, let it flow down, and let that dry up really nice and good. And then we're going to go into our final airbrush step. Alright, so we've got the same mixture of Flat Flesh and heavy skin tone in the airbrush. I added a little bit of flow improver while we were waiting for that wash to dry, so the paint would be a little bit thinner and would stay wet. And I'm just very transparently at a high angle spraying that over the center line of the face, and what that does is create a very soft shading on the face, and it gets you a really realistic skin tone. It looks awesome. That's why I like doing that. So that was our first part of the Masterclass series, all of the airbrushing stuff, and we will pick it up next time. Hope you guys enjoyed this first part of our new series, so make sure to catch the next installment. I'll see you next time.